it's gotten very quiet in here, so I guess there's anticipation for us to start. I've already said this multiple different times today, I guess I'll say it again. My name is Will. I'm a master's student of the Internet Institute here in Oxford, as well as the Technology and Democracy Networks lead at the Ditchley Foundation, which is partially why I guess I've ended up moderating this panel. We'll do a quick round of introductions of the panelists here. I'll then provide some very short remarks setting the scene of the discussion, and we'll launch into the panel discussion itself before Q&A. Keegan?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Dr. Keegan McBride. I'm a lecturer at the Oxford Internet Institute in AI, Government and Policy, and also the course director of our MSc program in Social Science of the Internet. And for the past 5+ years, been working a lot on AI-related issues in the public sector, geopolitics, international relations, and things around power, let's say.
Hi everyone. So I'm Carl. I'm a think tanker. I've been for a long time. So I founded the Centre for the United Social Media back in Demos in 2012, and then became an author and a podcaster. So I've just released a podcast with Intelligence Squared, trying to explore the shifting terrain of power in the age of AI.
Hi everyone. I think I'm going to be the industry perspective on this one. So I'm Kira from the Startup Coalition. I'm the head of tech regulation there. So all things AI right now. My background's in liability policy, and I've experience on the US and the EU, so done a lot when it comes to social media data and AI for a very long time, according to me, which is probably not very long.
Lovely. Well, thank you all, and in case you're wondering where Benedict and Brianna are, unfortunately Benedict had an emergency this morning, so could not join us, and Brianna is also ill. So they do send their apologies for not being able to be here, but we do also thank Keegan for stepping in last minute to fill in the spot. As I said before, I'll provide some brief remarks on the geopolitics of AI, and I want to start off with a quotation that I've just heard tossed around in many of my circles around the nation who leads in AI will rule the world. Does anyone know where that is from?
Putin.
Wonderful. I guess we were going to go for audience, but oh well. We appreciate it. We appreciate the contribution. But yeah, so Putin said this back in 2017, and while I may not be comfortable citing Putin as a credible source of information on AI, it does highlight just how critical of an influence AI has on the politics, economy, and cultures of a state. And it's to the point where it's become this key source of geopolitical competition around the world. When we think about the three pillars that really guide AI, compute, data, and talent, none of them are exempt from the geopolitical pressures we are seeing today, whether it's control of the choke points of compute access, data localization, or a race down to the bottom to acquire talent in the first place for developing these systems. And governments around the world are realizing this. We just heard from Chloe Smith about the UK AI Summit and the UK's commitment to this field. But there are so many more. I could spend all day listing all the different initiatives, white papers, plans to strategy actions that every country in the world is trying to execute in this field. So needless to say, this is a very sensitive topic. And that's all you're going to hear from me for the time being. But I'd like to first go down the panel here to ask a very generic question. What are some of your key concerns around the geopolitics of AI?
Go ahead, Keegan.
Well, I think for me the biggest concern is that there's a lot of myths that need to be busted when it comes to like AI and geopolitics and AI in the world today, because as much as we like to talk about AI, it's actually the stuff underneath it that's way more important. The infrastructure that allows AI to function, it's about the data centers, the subsea cables, talent, as you say, R&D, regulation. It's less about AI as much as it is about a broader digital transformation that the world is going through, and then the physical components underneath this, and what this has and implications for in terms of the balance of global power and development and innovation. I think this is where there could be a lot more room for development, let's say.
Well, firstly, everyone, thanks so much for coming to this one where we try and tackle, not one but two ravenously unpredictable megatrends kind of colliding with each other. I was gonna begin by trying to find a kind of the historical parallel that matters most to me. And it kind of feels like we're in that moment around the First World War where every country is kind of scrambling to kind of create its own kind of steel and coal capability, because it kind of realised that kind of it was only on the basis of that kind of modern armies could be used and modern advantage could be gained. But you'll permit me, my opening remark, I think, is to be slightly more general, maybe even more literary. And it's about the metaphors that we live by. So I think we're obviously stepping into an age that is unbelievably mysterious to almost everyone. Like, it's hard to see the future. It's hard to know what it's going to be like. It's hard to know what the technology is going to do, and it's hard to know how we're going to react. And I think it's an extremely human thing to do in that moment of doubt, to try and search for the metaphor that we think shines the light the brightest. So Nigel downstairs a moment ago was saying it's like fire, it's like the steam engine. People often point to moments of kind of, great technological disruption of the past and says this moment is a bit like those before us. And I think kind of the crossroad we're standing in, which one of these metaphors we choose to actually really grapple with and take on is really going to decide which direction we go down. And to me, and a lot of the kind of policy discussions I have in the think tank that I work in, there's some group of people that are saying this is kind of like nuclear technology, actually. Me and Keegan are going to disagree a bit, I think, over the course of this panel. Some people are saying it's a bit like nuclear technology. This is something which needs to be controlled, might well be a creature of largely states, will have to be licensed, and will have to be watched very, very carefully. That even in these early foothills, we can see the potential damage that it might do. And there's others, very, very powerful voices that say this is like open source software. This is open source software. And therefore will benefit from all the things that open source software benefited from. It will benefit from security, it will benefit from democratization, it will benefit from lots of people being able to do it. My starting contention is, I am not at all convinced that open source software is the right metaphor that we use and we think about and we actually grasp as we step into the early foothills of AI. More on that, and probably more disagreement between, I think, both of these fine people and me to come. But I'm laying that out there, I think, as a kind of early signpost. I don't know whether, when we go into these questions around geopolitics, when we go to questions around democracy, and around control, and around safety, and around regulation, whether it being open source is the right way of understanding this at all.
Oh gosh, don't know how I'm going to follow that up. So, Startup Coalition, a lot of the people in the room may know us as formerly CODEC, the Coalition for a Digital Economy. I think it's kind of in the name, or at least our former name, both of them put together what I'm going to be talking about. So, 3 months ago, we started a project with the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change and Onward, kind of to try to cross political aisles, get the startups in the room, make sure they're not on the menu. And we really tried to focus on all of these big issues that policymakers were talking about in the media, what the cycle around AI was. And when we got them all in the room, we got the investors in the room, we got everybody we could on one-on-one interviews, roundtables, whatever else. And the resounding thought, to quote American politics, is it's the economy, stupid. And then I was kindly reminded that I needed to take a step back and go back to basics. Repeatedly over the course of the 3 months, we've heard we need to maintain and nail the fundamentals. That's going to be a critical mode of change for us. It's going to be a critical mode for AI safety. It's going to be a critical mode for how we compete globally. It'll be a critical mode for how we handle bad actors and all of these geopolitical issues that AI will start foraying into. But at the end of the day, there are 4 fundamentals when it comes to a coalition for a digital economy and how you translate that to a coalition for an AI economy. And that is accessing capital throughout the life cycle. From startup to scale up to very large tech company accessing capital. Competing on compute and data infrastructure internationally. We're a very small island nation, and yes, we do punch above our weight. And we do punch above our weight on compute, but not nearly enough to go against the US and China. Same thing with open data. UK was the great British leader of open, the great international leader and the British leader on open data. We're not doing great right now in comparison. Other people have gotten much better at it, much quicker than we have. Hiring and bringing the best talent possibly. I'm American, and I think I would struggle to be good tech talent coming into the country. Very lucky I got into the country a different way. And many of the founders we talk to say the same thing. And finally, navigating the regulatory environment. that's where the founders wanted to talk about AI safety and really thought it was a big important issue, but it was one of many. Same thing on when it comes to how does current existing regulation affect AI? A lot of that clarity was unclear. That had to do with regulator capacity, it had to do with the fact that the AI white paper came out and the sandbox is in progress and is going to take quite a long time. A lot of it is also just them, their talent, and government need to catch up on what AI means, because the rate of change is so fast that like people who get paid to develop AI and people like me who get paid to think about AI policy are struggling to catch up. And that's going to affect all talent internationally. So those are our big four fundamentals, and I will probably be focusing a lot more on back to basics and how that will affect geopolitics and affect our ability effectively to compete.
Yeah. Well, thank you three very much for very powerful statements and a foreshadowing of what I anticipate will be a lot of butting of heads in this session. I think one common narrative I wanted to just highlight here, it seems to be like this very point around narratives, this point that there are myths, as you said, that need to be busted, that the metaphors that we live by, the narratives that are around them can determine how we move down this path for AI. And to probably really dive into the deep end around this narratives point and around what Carl has just highlighted, open source. I think, Keir, you mentioned that the question around talent, open data, UK being strong on open data, and the UK is currently leading in the number of open source AI companies in at least Europe. I'm not sure about statistics worldwide. So I think that on the one hand, for the UK to want to perhaps lean into the open source narrative would be a strategic advantage where it is ahead of others, and that is a sense of geopolitical advantage if others rely on that. But naturally there are other concerns, and I perhaps will leave it to Carl to voice those concerns, but I'd like to really spark this debate now on what the value of open source will be in terms of either ameliorating or intensifying the tensions around AI development now. I don't know if anyone would like to start.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy to kick this off. This should be pretty fun. I already foresee that this is going to be a little bit Anyway, when I think about AI and geopolitics, I think about this in the perspective that there are basically three things that are going to decide who wins this geopolitical conflict worldwide. Whether we want to admit that there's a conflict over AI or not, that's your choice, but there is. This is with my American sort of hat on. And these three things that are going to decide the winner are basically control of AI's infrastructure. You need to train AI. It's going to be strategic integration with the private sector, because the fact of the matter is the private sector is still the driving force behind all AI developments. And then the third is having a supportive regulatory environment to support innovation. Now, there is a commonly occurring story that AI is so powerful, so scary, it's going to help create bioweapons and create cyber attacks, and oh my God, we're going to have propaganda campaigns that are going to be driven by generative content. Therefore, we need to stop developing it. We need to start licensing the AI companies who can build it. We should start regulating at the GPU and compute level, what we're actually going to build. And that is just ridiculous in my mind, to be honest. Because what scares me even more is a centralized authoritarian future for AI, which is what this essentially is calling for. We know that these three companies are building AI, we like them, therefore we give them permission to build, and everybody else has to have some sort of substandard. And I am very passionate about making sure that that doesn't happen, because I think having a democratic approach to the development of AI, having this sort of open source approach to AI, one, allows us to make sure that we can mitigate some of these risks that people are concerned of, but two, it also helps us build and drive the creation of perhaps a more democratic future for artificial intelligence compared to the alternative. And I'm sure you're going to disagree with a lot of that.
Before you do, I'd like to have Keir jump in perhaps on, because what you mentioned, these three companies, and bringing in maybe the startup perspective here in terms of being able to widening that scope of industry involvement.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about DeepMind, Anthropic, and OpenAI, I'm assuming, that's a really large influx of capital into 3 companies, A. But B, the UK's unique value add is we've got an incredibly diverse tech ecosystem. We've got like 1,700 or so, it grows every day and also shrinks every day. AI companies, only 48 of them are doing generative AI. That should say and establish just how hard it is to compete with massive, massive pools of capital coming from the US and massive opportunities. At the exact same time, you've got France who's put, 500 million euros into Mistral and has created a French champion of LLMs. And we could talk about all of the different versions. There's a very powerful one in the Middle East. There's a lot of powerful options coming out there that could compete. But at the end of the day, founders here are incredibly worried that when it comes to regulation and comes to regulation of AI and specifically generative AI, it immediately is going to go to who's the most knowledgeable. Of course, that's going to involve DeepMind, Anthropic, and OpenAI. And because they're so large, it can almost feel like, oh, well, we don't need to include the startups and the scale-ups, and maybe their perspectives are equally included, and we can think about them later on. That's a recipe for market entrenchment if I've ever heard one. And that's also something we see a lot when it comes to open source, is open source in the Internet of Things has been able to really diversify the options. Same thing with mobile ecosystems and app development. Like, there's an incredible diversity in choices that can pop up because of it. That can be good and bad. There are bad actors in everything. They're bad actors in nations. That's an effective, fact of the world, unfortunately. But removing and making it harder for newer entrants who are trying to compete safely and scale safely is almost killing our ability to compete before we even start. And that's almost where clear regulation is a must, and clarifying regulation and narrow pinprick approaches are probably more effective than what some did, Italy with ChatGPT, ban them all kind of stuff.
Perfect. Carl, I don't know if you would like to respond at this time.
Calling for the open sourcing of AI models up to an arbitrary level of capability is a maniacal commitment to a kind of nihilistic, chaotic future that would see almost no precedent in any other area of important societal activity that we have. Step away from the open source analogy. This is why I don't think it's a good one. No one's saying stop. That's such a straw man, Keegan. No one's saying stop.
Tons of people are saying stop.
I'm not saying stop. Okay. Serious voices here do not credibly call for the cessation of work. What they're calling for are for us to put the kinds of rules and controls on this kind of work that we would see in accountancy, or that we would see in legal work. Society always tries to control concentrations of power, very rightly so. It puts bars around concentrations of power, and those bars are multifarious. They can be norms and professional standards and audits and know your customer regimes and ways of being struck off if you break those rules. And yes, sometimes regulations and sometimes inspections. They are intricate, usually well thought out, usually collaboratively composed schemes, and serious people are calling for that. They're not calling for some kind of bland cessation of all work. But what you're doing, if you're saying, oh, I think it's actually ideologically fine to throw out a super intelligence at some point for the very worst actors in society to use, you basically make it completely impossible for us to impose those kinds of checks and regimes and controls around this very, very powerful software. AI is not the Linux kernel. It doesn't benefit from the same kind of benefits that lots of open source software does. You put a model out in the open sources, you don't actually have lots of people going over the code, actually checking it for its security. These models aren't decipherable to us, right? It's not the code out there, it's a giant pile of numbers. There's lots of misanalogies when you try and actually compare an AI model when it's open source to other forms of software, and it's open sourced. And by the way, like there's this way that I think is being presented of open source, like it's these plucky underdogs, you know, a kind of Wikipedia for the AI age that's all getting together and like in this voluntary and non-profit way throwing these models together. That is absolute nonsense. You know, the people that are throwing out the models are Mistral and Meta. You know, these are hyper-capitalized companies that are open sourcing their models because they think that there is a developmental advantage in doing so they can catch up with GPT. Let's not kid ourselves that there is a kind of, you know, a kind of hippie version to the capitalist vision for AI, right? So basically what we're opting for, if we're choosing for the open source vision, is we're just choosing one commercial vision over another and one which is going to be far less amenable to democratic control and the imposition of values outside of those companies. And that is an old story. That goes back to Web 2, which I'm old enough to be part of that debate 10 years ago. You know, and I can see the same contours and the same arguments being trotted out once again.
So I feel like there's probably a couple of bits of nuance. I'm not going to be able to capture all the ones I want to add in this statement because I'm probably going to just lose them in my brain as I'm going. The first one is founders, more often than not, who do use open source technology are using it to reduce their barriers of entry, to compete effectively with, oh, we can't get the like 90 million that Synthesia did because we're much more early stage. How do we actively get the product we want to market quicker? And that's a really effective way to compete. And I don't think anybody's saying ban closed systems. That feels a little like where that might have been implying. But like the diversity of AI is going to probably thrive in both places. And that's going to be helpful because our startup ecosystem can find places where they can lower the costs to market and do so safely. And also take all of that upon themselves and also build that way. It's just offering more entries for entrepreneurs and AI specialists and technologists to find ways to make their services effective. The second one that I kind of want to poke on is, I mean, I don't disagree. I don't think AI is necessarily an open source question because when we're talking about the models that some founders build on, it is Palm, it is Llama, it is all of these things. But the other question is going to be, where do we go next with that, and how do we actually make it so that we can compete otherwise? And that will still go back to the fundamental questions of we don't have the clear, narrow regulation. Our regulators do currently struggle to understand AI. It's a completely changing environment. And yes, like Ofcom scaled up for the Online Safety Act, and the ICO is a data protection authority. AI is so cross-cutting. So many more regulators are going to have to scale up the capacity and level of like Ofcom. The DRCF is going to be so much wider. Collaboration is going to be critical on that one. And then our policymakers are going to have to keep up. That's almost the issue of clear and narrow regulation more so than if closed and open systems work out. Because I don't think we can get to that debate or effectively talk about that if at the end of the day we're not actually answering the questions effectively. That's just some slight gripes and nuances.
Keegan, I don't know if you want to add here.
You can go to the next question. If you
Well,
want to.
well, I was going to...
Oh, really? Keegan, I thought you were going to like back into it.
I don't. What I want to avoid is getting completely lost in the open source thing because there's so much more to this, right? Because, okay, first of all, what do we mean when we talk about open source? Are we talking about the weights? Are we talking about the source code? If you just have the source code, this basically means nothing. Do you want the...
I'm talking about the technical information sufficient to allow you to run it on your own system.
So, I mean, but this is my point, right? It's a continuum. It's a scale. It's not
parameters, like, training data, source code.
It's not binary, 1 or 0.
You can define it.
Yeah. And Stanford just put out a whole new transparency index, and you can see how they define different aspects of transparency. Do they release the data? Do they release words? And so on and so forth. The other part of this is we already have a lot of regulation which applies to AI. It's not like this is operating in a vacuum and all of a sudden no regulation counts. If you're using AI to cause harm, to discriminate against somebody, if you're, you can't kill people, you can't commit fraud, you can't commit cyber attacks, you can't commit a terrorist attack. It doesn't matter if you use AI or if you do something else, it's still illegal, right? So then the question is, okay, are we regulating this specific technology? Are we going to do this every time a new technology comes out? Or are we regulating the use cases, which we have a lot of experience doing? And then it's more about empowering the sort of regulators that already exist to be able to compete and do their jobs in the age of AI, because frankly, many regulators are already struggling with this. So it's a question about empowerment and allowing them to do their jobs, for example, if it's the CMA or if it's the ICO or some other sort of UK-based organization. Then the other part of this is that, unfortunately, the way that the world works is that companies are going to go where they have the most friendly regulatory environment. Economies of scale do matter. It will be very hard for companies or for countries to match capabilities that, for example, the US already has due to economies of scale. We have all the data centers already built. We have ridiculous amounts of capital. Everybody wants to come and work in the US. We have huge R&D advantages, work talent advantages. We're years ahead of many countries, I would say, in the AI race. And then this raises the question, if we want to start getting into like the global regulation of this stuff, why should they care, basically? And this isn't necessarily my opinion, but if you think about it from their level, like what is the UK bringing to the table, for example, with the UK AI Safety Summit? I mean,
it's a bit mean.
but
doing our best.
but I don't mean this in an insulting way, right? But I mean this honestly. If you have if you limit it to frontier risk, to existential risk or to frontier models, these are primarily built by American companies on American infrastructure. Yeah. You guys just left the EU, so the market's smaller. You have very restricted visas.
Are you talking on behalf of America now?
No, I am just saying.
As the other American, it just kind of feels like my brain is being the same.
No, but I mean, the point is, it's very nice to have this ideological view and utopian view of the world, right? But the fact of the matter is that this is the environment that we're operating in. Like, state actors do bad things. They're going to do it whether they have AI or not. They already do cyber attacks. China, Russia, very proficient APTs. They are already engaging in cyber. You can look at the reports coming out of the Five Eyes that look at how much China has risen as a sort of cybersecurity threat in the last couple of years. Terrorist actors are still doing, like, all of these things are going to happen. It doesn't matter if AI exists or not.
If I could defend the UK on AI safety, just a little. The Frontier AI Task Force and the fact that there's that agreement in discussions with DeepMind, Anthropic, and AI, so the largest frontier models, for early access to their systems, is a really good sign that we're already incredibly competitive on AI safety internationally. We have one of the largest safe capacities to analyze, test, and everything at the end of the day after 2023's saga of AI policy changes from government, which I'm not going to sit here and say all founders loved all of them, but at the end of the day, one of the largest state capacities. So we are competitive in a lot of regards there. Where we aren't competitive, and we are still competitive, and I'm saying this all with like a grain of salt, we're third in investment. That's pretty good. Now, we're third in investment where we're here and the US is like all the way up here. So we're competitive with caveats on there's no way we could become number one without systemic changes. Talent, same issue. Brexit is an incredibly hard to handle thing because it cut the consumer block that founders were in or could enter, because they're still in them, but like could enter, made it harder. And it cut it overnight, basically. Compute, we are competitive. I think the statistic though is we went from 3rd to 10th and now we're 6th. So we're competitive within some span of imagination, but again, us here, America here, China and Europe floating in between and competing with us. I think that's almost where, when it comes to AI globally, that's our competitive angle. AI safety-wise, we didn't fully do it, but we're doing it competitively. Not to put too fine of a thing on it. And also founders, we have a couple AI safety founders who I've talked to in depth about this stuff and how they're feeling. And AI Safety Summit, welcome sign. AI safety is a priority, welcome sign. The big caveat being any regulation on AI safety can't make it harder to make AI safety tech. And making sure we have that narrow focus, because the EU AI Act wasn't as narrow of a focus as they thought it was. And you saw that with all of the criticism of high risk versus low risk and the fact it was going to over-encompass. There's a fear of that happening when it comes to AI safety too. Founders who want to innovate and make sure that we have the tech necessary to deal with bad actors who will exist anyways. AI is out of the bag. Like misinformation, disinformation. We lived through 2016. It's been here for years. that's out of the bag, and so we need to make sure we're innovating to be able to counter that with what it means at the rate of innovation we're currently facing.
So, before you come in, Carl, and this may relate, you've brought up that point of, do safety, but innovate at the speed to be able to keep up with things. I think this point of keeping up also then ties, and this has been brought up a couple of times, ties with this narrative of China, in terms of, especially in the US, keeping pace enough that China does not acquire the capabilities to have AI that's capable of doing things like cybersecurity attacks, things just generally have capabilities to really boost its economy, politics, and military. And so I'd be intrigued to probe this a little bit more in terms of what the thoughts are in terms of China's direction, whether this tension around safety versus innovation as it's framed in the China narrative is justified. I'd be intrigued to hear. And Carl, maybe we can come to you first, as I cheated you out of a response just now.
I'm going to blend this in. You might all be relieved that as we move into China, we might actually find some consensus amongst the panel. But look, I mean, just firstly briefly, so my day job, what I spend most of my time doing is actually pulling apart adversarial influence operations coming from autocratic nation-state actors. That's what I actually spend most of my time doing. Just the argument that there are bad actors out there and they're going to continue to do bad things and therefore what we do doesn't make a difference is a terrible argument. It's what they're working on is a tradecraft. They innovate too, and they use the tools they have available too. And we've seen that tradecraft get much more sophisticated since 2016. It is a constant, real, reciprocal strategic dynamic between offense and defense. And we've been worrying about this kind of offensive-defensive balance when it comes to information spaces for a long time now. And genuinely, there are new threat vectors that generative AI models create, which actually have nothing to do with making images which might fool people. They've got everything to do with weaponizing friendships and belonging and kinship and bringing 10,000 people from a target audience into 10,000 in parallel conversations. We could not do that before generative models, and we can now. So there are step change threats which bad actors get hold of when they get hold of these models. And let's not pretend that just because it was happening in the past, it's going to happen in the future. The decisions we make around the accessibility of these models don't matter. They do matter. And they really matter when it comes to us protecting our elections and us protecting our kind of social and political life, minority communities around the world that are targeted by these kinds of people, conspiracy theories which are whipped up and amplified by these kinds of people. They really do matter. What I actually want to talk about, because I think it really is an important argument, this, balancing, this kind of high wire balancing act that we have when we have kind of competition and regulation, don't we? On the one hand, we've got fears around safety and therefore slow it down and control it. On the other, I think everyone recognises that the UK could or could not be part of the AI story. We are not a country which is inevitable, but we're a country where it could be a really important part of our economic life. Which I'm sure the AI Safety Summit is definitely reflecting, I think, in its own way. But to me, I worry about this argument that, we've got to remain competitive with the United States. That's the only way in which we can be part of that story. Because I worry about that because it's such a powerful argument. But what I think it does is it kind of forces us to do something which we actually don't do in the UK, which is to embody a US regulatory culture. And actually, we're very different societies to the United States. We don't have the same regulatory culture as the United States. Across a whole bunch of consumer rights legislation, market legislation, we actually have quite different laws. And I don't think we would in the UK, all things being considered, be as laissez-faire as inevitably the United States is going to be when it comes to AI regulation.
I don't disagree. I'd like to make that clear.
Yes, but what I'm saying is that, saying, we've got China, I'm bringing it over to China, we've got China nipping at our heels in one direction, and we've got United States drawing talent in another, and we've got to make sure that our regulatory culture somehow manages to stay competitive with those two things, I think kind of drains away the impetus that we would otherwise feel to try and put some of these things under control. And I do worry about that, because going back to social media 10 years ago, in a different way, we were hearing exactly those arguments. These are US companies, how can we regulate them? This is going to come out of the US. And actually just compared to what social media is going to do, like that's vanilla compared to what the impact of these models might be over the next 10 years, like in terms of their societal impacts. I don't think we can afford to step back and wait for the US to regulate.
So if I can quickly jump in here to add a layer on top of that, it's no longer just waiting for the US to regulate, but it's also how are we going to be influenced by the regulations, say the EU AI Act, or perhaps even more, not worryingly, but even more complicating now, the recent China announcement of its global AI governance initiative.
And we've announced our own international panel on AI safety. I don't know if you saw that, but that's the IPCC for AI that's coming out. So there's all going to be competing agencies now.
I mean, that's the exact point. There are all these competing agencies, competing ideas around how to go about it. But phrased in similar ways, but obviously there are underlying things that are going to be different about them. How many different directions can we be pulled in terms of trying to find, in the UK context, trying to find the UK's own direction in this space? That's the only thing I'd like to add on top of that. But Kira, I know you wanted to say something. Keegan, if you'd like to jump in as well.
Well, I think we heard time and time again that regulatory convergence is incredibly valuable. Startups that want to scale up and or are scaling up currently do not want to have to face, okay, I'm in the UK, let me go to a different place, and then it's wham, have to completely change your business model. That is something that I think at the Startup Coalition we're constantly thinking about. For us, the founders' primary concern before we even got there was we don't know how XYZ regulation, I mean, like AI affects everything, so climate techs were giving us regulations I've never heard of because I've never worked in energy policy in my life, to the social media AI companies that had ones I understood, lots about GDPR, lots about the new data reform bill, lots about automated decision making. All of these need clarification first. The EU AI Act, I mean, I worked remotely in Brussels, and so I've been there quite a lot when it comes to AI. It's still in trilogues, isn't it? It has changed and unchanged quite a lot, but for the founders, the biggest concern for them was high risk, low risk. And it highlighted to them a case of over-regulation can mean stifling innovation. It's not regulation and innovation are inherently competitive. They wanted to repeat that there is a way that both of them can grow to be successful, as much as it is maybe don't broaden your categories or so bluntly hit our regulation that we are now worried with complying. But at the end of the day, when we're talking competition with China and the US and with all of the people below us and all of these metrics, maybe it's not regulation, maybe it's the fact that we need to change the incentive structures for investment so that we can have pension fund reform and SEIS and EIS and VCT reform so that we can build the capital to succeed, but also build the capital that innovators with really incredible missions and visions and values are building their AI here. Maybe it's we get the correct talent, practitioners, policymakers, founders, technologists, that at the end of the day we've created an ecosystem so vibrant with AI that inherently we've brought the best and the most talented and the most visionary, but also ethical people here. Founders want to make sure that their visions and missions stay in their businesses. I don't know a single one who's like, yeah, my mission means nothing. If I did, I'd be genuinely concerned for the success of their business. All of that plays into our international competition. It does play into the fact that, like, the dynamic isn't necessarily how do we compete on regulation on AI specifically. It's how do we compete on regulation that incentivizes safe scaling of AI here. And that actually is a question far beyond the regulation of how to make AI safe and responsible. That's a big part of it, but we won't incentivize that without the proper investment structures, without the proper immigration structures, talent structures, spin-outs. Probably the wrong room to say spin-outs, I realize, as I say Oxford. All of that is a big first step for then having the talent and the ability to have really strong conversations. And we're already having a lot of them. We do have a lot of this here. It's why we have AI Safety Summits. It's why we've got incredible power when it comes to talking about AI safety globally.
Keegan, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about like geopolitical conflict or conflicts with China, right? It's AI is a small part of this. It's not like we're competing over models. It's about data centers. It's about the subsea cables. You can read a great article in the Financial Times that talks about how China is basically being forced out of the sort of subsea cable network because they don't want them to have control over the internet traffic. And then it's about cloud and data centers. It's about the data that's powering these algorithms. It's about all of these things. And the reason why this is a major concern is because the globe is becoming increasingly digitalized. And as much as we dislike the idea that nationalism still exists, it does, and it's probably still going to, we're probably not going to get rid of the nation state anytime soon. Now, why all of this matters, right, in terms of having domestic capability, in terms of why you should care about competing with America and so on, because the risk is, here's the way that the world's going. We're becoming increasingly digital. Governments are going to have to digitalize basically to remain relevant. What this means is technologies like AI are going to become an important part of the public sector, an important part of running society. Now, if you are in the situation where you live in Europe, or you're, I don't know, France or Denmark or whatever, and you want to be a digital government, and AI is going to be a part of it, you want to have this be a domestic thing. You don't want it to be an American company. And so this is the concern, right? This is why you see all these issues around digital sovereignty, data sovereignty, because we want to avoid the situation, we, with my European sort of hat on, where Amazon, I know, I'm sorry, but this is the thing, right? And this is what this is all about. It's all about the balance of power and how these things are transforming. We see conflict emerging in South America and in Africa, particularly between the US and China, because at the moment there are less access, there's less data centers there, and the model that is being offered by the sort of Chinese state is very attractive to some leaders in that place, and the US is a little bit behind in trying to push back. But this is all part of a broader thing. It's not just about AI, it's about the transformation that we're going through as a society, as a public sector, as a state, the role of digitalization, all of the pieces that come up and play a role in this. Because the risks are huge if you get this wrong. And it's why the EU is pushing so hard. And France tried to build a sovereign cloud, it failed. UK wants to do it. In the EU, they're also pushing toward Gaia X and all these sorts of things. And this is what it's about. And so this is why it's so important to get it right. And if you get the regulatory regime wrong, and companies don't feel attracted to build this sort of stuff here, or you get the policies wrong, you don't provide the right funding, you don't have access to talent, you're putting yourself as a government at risk in the future. And this gets tied into and this is where the China part also comes in, which is that we don't want that model to take over the rest of the world. And we see this already happening in the governance of the internet, where authoritarian actors like China and Russia are cooperating and collaborating to drive more authoritarian norms through different means. And people are seeing this, and they see the potential for this to happen in the global regulation of AI, and they want to push back against this, which is exactly why the initial global AI regulatory regimes excluded China by default. Because you see GPI, and this is why there's a whole bunch of drama over China being included in the AI Safety Summit. So it's, I think my message is it's much more than just AI. It's about the broader digital transformations. It's about everything that lies underneath. It's about the sort of future that we want. Who holds the power? Where is it balanced? And it's important to keep this sort of system and the broader image in mind when we have these debates.
So to then pick up on that, I completely agree there that there is a much broader debate.
So do I, for the record.
An agreement at last. But the question is then, and hopefully this will take a bit of a brighter turn than the route that we've been going down. As we've seen from the past, let's say 5, 6, probably even longer, so much around localizing data in one's own country, whether it's around bringing supply chains into one's own country as well, all these fun terms like onshoring. We've seen a bit of a shift away from that, if anything. We've seen a realization, even from like the US, which is like, let's take semiconductors as the example, the US being probably the most likely country in the world to be able to bring all aspects of the semiconductor supply chain into its own borders. I say most likely, I don't say they're going to be successful, but they are the most well positioned. But even they are realizing that they can't afford to do this alone, and that there needs to be a bit more international coordination. And so then to almost take the flip of what you were saying around the Russia-China coordination, what about coordination? I don't want to say coordination amongst the like-minded countries, because the ideal goal would be global coordination, which obviously realism hinders that a bit. But what are perhaps the coordination measures that can be achieved across countries that can then help to ameliorate geopolitical tensions across list like the UK or US or Europe or countries in Southeast Asia or Africa who have resources, who have skills that could be really capitalized on in this broader ecosystem. And like talent being one example here. I don't know what we want to talk about that here, or resources, cables, or data. So just something to check out there, and perhaps something to mull over now.
Well, Keegan very, very usefully raised this question of internet governance, which I'm actually like obsessed by, because sometimes it's both unbelievably boring and arcane and obscure in many cases, but also unbelievably important. And like you can often see this conflict happening at the Internet Governance Forum, at the International Telecommunications Union. It's kind of half international diplomatic legalese and half deeply technical, but there is a conflict happening right now on the whole stack of different protocols and procedures and rules which govern the internet. And there's one broad group, I suppose, around the G7 with American leadership that's trying to kind of maintain this kind of multi-stakeholder vision, which like increasingly looks like a bit of a hobbit wandering around Mordor and the kind of, the kind of age of geopolitics that's emerged, where we've got all these different stakeholders and civil societies invited and the academics invited. And we have a Russo-Chinese opposition to that has proved to be quite attractive to quite a lot of countries across South Asia and Africa especially. I think, like, however much we would like it not to be the case, I think at this point to say that these technologies will be the tools of alleviation and amelioration of that, rather than creatures of an increasing split, I think would be massively naive. Like, we are going into a world now that is going to be split into two different technospheres, I think. One under the US and one under China. They will be governed by radically different principles. They will be governed with different values at their heart. And it remains to be seen, like, the level of interoperability that will be allowed between them. There was a protocol that's being pitched to try and replace TCP/IP that I wrote up for the New Scientist a couple of years ago, called Digital Object Architecture. And I was like, oh my God, basically this protocol, if implemented, allows states to become basically the key librarian of the internet. It concentrates power in a really important way, but it was so arcane, it was almost impossible to get any media outlet to actually run it. And actually my fear quite often is that this whole layer of governance and protocols is really overlooked when we talk about power, and it's really overlooked when we talk about like public scrutiny and media attention as well. But those are the spheres I think we're going to divide into, sadly. And just lastly, to kind of stick one more knife into open source, I genuinely don't, if this is going to be the future, and if we do decide, well, liberal democracies have to retain like the advantage when it comes to attracting talent, when it comes to AI capability fundamentally, I also don't see how open sourcing stuff is actually in aid of any of that. Like, to me, like, some kind of managed access to these models is also actually quite important to stop autocrats using those things for domestic repression, apart from anything else. Like, like these models are extremely general. Like, that's one of the strange things about them that feels very different to the tools of the past. They can be, I was talking to all these people in India that are putting GPT to the most amazing uses that the people in OpenAI would never have imagined, translating the labyrinthine, arcane Indian government website into 10 different small languages so that small farmers can work out what agrarian subsidies they might be owed. There's no one in OpenAI thought that was possible. Right, so it's got loads of brilliant uses, don't get me wrong. Like, kind of, like, for every terrible use, there is an empowerment just around the corner. I absolutely recognise that fundamental dualism of this technology in the age we're living in. But on the other hand, what we're putting out there, we will not be able to control or limit when you open source it for an autocrat to use. So I really don't see why we should be doing this. I think, like, personally, I think we should, like, there is an open source community, and their achievements are unquestionable. But right now we've got a lot of very bad actors and a lot of quite bleak futures on the horizon. We have to steer around those sorts of things.
But I'm sorry, how do you handle the sort of disconnect between your view on AI and your view on the internet? Because, like, it seems to me, for example, that you support this more sort of like open approach to internet standards, a sort of open approach to governance, all these other sorts of things, but then you come around and you say, actually, when it comes to AI, it should be closed.
No, as I said, I don't think the Linux kernel and a cutting edge frontier foundational model are the same thing. And I think, like, the Internet Governance Forum isn't saying there should be no governance. It's saying that governance should be multi-stakeholder based. But it's all about setting loads of rules. TCP/IP sets rules. We can set rules at the protocol level. Without rules, the internet doesn't work. All I'm saying is we have to find ways of putting the rules around these models. And that becomes very, very difficult to do when you open source a model so that the authors of them have absolutely no control or knowledge of how they're being used. That's my basic point.
Okay. Kim, do you have something to add to this? Or?
I don't know if I do, but mostly because I'm just going to remind everyone, the vast majority of UK founders in AI do not do frontier. Generative AI is like a very small percentage of what AI founders here do. So this is an incredibly important conversation, but for the vast majority of AI that's being developed in the UK, can often feel like a very important conversation happening for a very small select group of them, whereas the rest of them are hoping for an equally large conversation.
Is there a bit that we missed, do you think?
I'm not a geopolitical expert in this regard. I do think IGF and ICANN have incredibly important powers. I do remember multiple founders telling me that the TTC's 4-month definitions was incredibly important because it showed that all of our definitions weren't across the board the same between the OECD, the US, the UK, the Hiroshima process. All of these multi-nation processes were showing a significant lack of understanding of the way that IGF does what AI means, but separate conversation for what most startups and scale-ups care about.
No, I think to then pick up on that very last bit though, like in terms of what startups and scale-ups care about, and in terms of also like what AI is, because obviously this is the Generative AI conference, you've paid to be here to learn a bit more about generative AI. But it's an interesting thing about like what kinds of AI systems are having the most impact right now, and what are we worried about? And I guess it's this tension between short-term, long-term, immediate impact, horizon impact, even more future impact. What do we not know in terms of like, if we dive into the generative AI, what are the capabilities that we still don't know about? And tying into what Nigel was saying earlier, we simply just have no idea what they can do, even if they are for the benefit of humanity in that regard. Did you?
Yeah, so briefly on that and around frontier. So a lot of my concern is not stemming at all from what GPT might be used for today. I mean, that has changed things like information warfare, but in ways which is manageable. My main worry is just this uncertainty around the pace of change that we're going to see. And people very, very often talk about exponentials here. And the rule about exponentials when it comes to plodding things like regulation is that you're either going to be too soon or you're going to be too late. Like, we are not going to have a kind of empirical, kind of clear picture around these things about when the right moment is to step in. So it's not really the future now that I'm really worried about. It's just listening to the inventors themselves, listening to the technologists, listening to the projections. You know, we might just be in such a radically transformed environment, but with a blink of an eye, you know, we've got to start preparing for that today. That's really what's driving my, you know, which might strike you, many of you, as being a kind of, you know, a dangerously pro-regulatory or kind of too closed opinion. I don't know what the room feels about the debate we're having, which I think is an extremely useful one. And there's so much of virtue in what Keegan is saying as well here. But like, yeah, it's that exponential curve that keeps me up late at night.
I think the main thing is, right, it's like I'm also not going to say that we should have no regulation whatsoever. The point is we already do have some regulations. We already do have regulators who can do these things. Then the question is, it's like, what is this right balance between innovation and regulation? And that's really hard to get right. In my mind, I think it's important that we still allow and provide the opportunities for this innovation, that we demonstrate the powerful examples of AI, that we start to, I mean, let's take the UK as an example. How could the UK sort of demonstrate itself as an AI superpower? One thing we already know, if you look at the AI State of AI report, UK is ranked third, US is ranked first. People are going to be looking to the UK, to the US to see what can we do with AI, what is its, you know, the positive potential it can bring. And it's important that we have these examples that we can point to and say, look at these things that it can do. And
and they exist for sure.
Yes, and this is exactly my point. So as much as we like to talk about the regulation, all the bad things that can happen, it's just important that we don't get lost in that and then forego the potential benefits it can bring. And for me, like, so my grandpa was born in 1916. He went to school on horseback. He died when he was over 100, and SpaceX was landing rockets on drone ships in the ocean. Like, technology changes society, and it happens fast, and that's never going to stop. And it's just important that we keep this in mind as well. It's not like this is something new. We have been dealing with these things for a long, long time.
We don't have 100 years.
No, I mean, it's coming.
We don't have close to 100 years.
On that slightly bleaker note, but also wasn't where I intended to stop things, but I guess on that slightly bleaker note, and Carl, you already said you're intrigued to hear about what the audience thinks. I think we do have to move to a Q&A session now.
Awesome.
For this panel. So please, yeah.
Look.
Wonderful.
Onrush.
So I believe I saw this gentleman's hand first, and then yours in the back, and then yours. So we'll point it out again, but please go ahead.
I'm just going to be very quick here because I'm making more of a comment rather than a question, which is that you can download now off of the GitHub the appropriate Python package that will do generative models. And any one of our graduate students at the OII could put together a generative AI large language model in about an evening. They wouldn't have much trouble. They'd have trouble because they wouldn't have much good data, and they wouldn't have a lot of compute. But that's not the problem. That's a resource issue. That's not a conceptual issue. You know, this knowledge is already very widespread. It's very easy for anyone to do with just a little bit of knowledge. And so, you know, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind that, you know, this is already here.
Yeah. No, a very important reflection. I don't know if others want to. Yeah. Not then.
No, I mean Mistral. You know, Mistral 7B that's been released. You can run that on your phone. Mm-hmm. I mean, for sure. And partly like someone might, you know, I mean, what implicitly some of what I'm saying is there's a small number of very well-capitalized companies that will continue to break the boundaries, and we can control those and therefore kind of control the tech. And so I might say, actually, that's not necessarily how it's going to go. I don't think we really know, because it might well be that much smaller models, you know, are created with, you know, much less, much more economic and cost-effective training runs, you know, much smaller number of parameters. That's really possible too.
Right. I mean, that distinction between extremely large, very general models and much smaller, very focused models on particular topics and themes is one that is not clear right now, because there are companies working on both of those, and nobody has any idea which one is going to be more successful and under what circumstances.
Yeah, lots of bets being placed on the side.
Someone's going to lose a lot of money, someone's going to lose a lot of money. Nobody knows which is which.
I think that's why it's incredibly important that our immigration system is able to keep up. So we naively, I would say, we as both an American and as a person who's chosen this place as my home country, we have the talent to find these niche solutions, because our unique value potential in AI, our biggest one, is health right now. It's our biggest AI sector. Let's capitalize on like the incredible specialized talent we've got here and make it easier to get that here, separate from AI safety, because that would mean we could have better entrepreneurs. But that requires us reforming the high potential individual visa, that requires us reforming the global talent, that requires us reforming the innovative founder. I could go on about the immigration reforms that would mean that the talent required to harness this could be here, but that's the critical factor I think the founders would really love to see, because it meant more of them come.
The gentleman over here, if you can just wait for us to hand the mic over to you so the online audience can also hear the question.
Hi there, my name is Gui Silva from Tigos Capital. We invest in early stage up to Series A startups in AI and blockchain. My question touches a few of the points raised by you. And one of the points raised by Dr. Keegan was about the regulators already struggling to cope with what we have at the moment. They don't have the resource, and I think they don't have the tools. My question goes to the tools, and I want to hear from you guys who have been thinking about this. How can we help regulators with the correct tools to regulate AI? Normally we talk about 100 years, but normally regulators, when you look back in history, I was just doing a little research on that, they take 20 to 30 years to really get the grips and regulate the industry more or less okay. We're still trying to regulate Meta. In how many years? So it's still maybe another 10 years to regulate properly. And so when we think about UK experience as well, and just briefly story that you guys probably know, in 1886, the UK was trying to regulate the automobiles, the auto industry, and they come up with this great idea that we should have someone running with a red flag in front of the car, just to warn pedestrians. That's why the red flag, this is a red flag expression comes about. Took them 30 years, 28 years to change that rule from 1886. So just no one, like guys like you could have talk about tools. Maybe we should have traffic lights. Maybe we should have stop signs. We can still do red, but they seat belts maybe instead of doing a guy to run there in front of the car. Anyway, my point is that the regulators are already struggling. Guys like you have been thinking about this. What kind of tools do you think that you can come up with that can help them?
This is exactly the hardest problem. For example, in the US, many of these foundation model companies and other AI companies have agreed to a series of sort of like best practices or whatever around on regulation safety of AI. If you were to go to a company and say, here's my algorithm, tell me if it's biased or not, they have no idea what to do. Regulators are so outgunned, it's not even funny. They're underfunded, understaffed, and they are years behind in most cases what's going on in the private sector. And so the solution is, at least in the UN and some other countries, let's just build a new regulator, a new AI inspectorate or something like this. But everybody else should already be dealing with AI-related issues, because it's not like it just exists on its own. It's touching things like equality, like welfare, discrimination. All of these issues are being touched by AI. And this is exactly what we need to start thinking about, which is how can we become more effective at regulating, basically. Because just adding more regulation, not more regulation, but creating new offices doesn't fix that problem. And having the tools and empowering them to be able to deal with these sorts of issues is incredibly important, but it's often overlooked. And this is why I get very worried about these sorts of conversations, because it can also be a little bit like deflection, like, oh, we have this new shiny office, but they don't have any institutional weight. Nobody, usually you have stronger regulation when it's placed in a ministry or an organization like Ministry of Finance or something like this, where they have some sort of weight they can throw around. People tend to ignore the new ones. You need a lot of political support. You need them to have the tools that they require to do this sort of regulation or to do the inspection, but there's so much work that needs to be done. It's not as easy as like creating a new thing, which I think is often overlooked, as you point out, perhaps.
I was there like kind of 13 years ago with governments and the platforms when the platforms said, well, I don't think it's our problem that terrorists are using our platform. Why aren't the police looking into that? That's a matter for the states. And then they said, there needs to be global norms around all this stuff because we can't implement this only in one country. And then they said, can you define all of this, please? It's been 10 years of like prevarication and delay. And actually, when you do lay this out in law, like they can do that stuff. When you actually create a kind of regulatory requirement for them to do so, it's not easy, but like you can navigate all this kind of stuff. And like one of the reasons I get quite passionate about this debate now is like I am absolutely determined we must not go through that 10 years again with this. Well, we must not. We must not have parliamentarians take 10 years to go from what can we possibly do about Facebook all the way through to the Online Safety Act. I think the good news, as a note of pessimism, is I don't think we're going to. Because I think actually there's a lot of memories and a lot of voices that kind of still that remember, the turmoil of trying to firstly convince the platforms to do stuff and then finally to actually legislate for them. And then finally we're here. This is a bright new age when it comes to social media, thank God. Both in Europe and here in the UK with the Online Safety Act now, not an Online Safety Bill. The tools. So I don't know. I think some of the suggestions have been it's already illegal to do illegal stuff. So it's not regulated. I mean, there's law to stop you, say, committing cybercrime whether you're using AI or not. There's law to stop you doing harassment whether you're using AI or not. And all of that is true. I embedded myself with a police cybercrime team for a while when I was writing a book a couple of years ago about power and AI, and I can tell you we are living through one of the worst crises in law enforcement in the history of modern policing. The police are absolutely overwhelmed as it is with cybercrime. We do not have effective enforcement. The answer is not to push a whole series of new enforcement responsibilities down to the individual users of this technology. That is not going to work. Like, so instead we do have to focus on what is being designed, who it's made access to, and the responsibilities of the developers, because there it's going to be much more concentrated. And so the answer there is, well, what do we do then? Like, and I think it's actually like the way that really, practically, we always try and control these things, which is a kind of whole dense network of both formal and less formal means. So yes, probably a new body, yes, new powers. I mean, Ofcom has been transformed as it stepped into digital regulation, you know, and all this, I mean, many of them are my former interns, and now all these talent flowing in there, digital researchers, entirely new kinds of people, all kind of, you know, fired up, ready to go. It's amazing to see how Ofcom's transformed. But around Ofcom, you'll have norms, you know, and hopefully we'll have a Royal College of Algorithmists or something come together, some kind of professional body, you know, and even like kind of more like, you know, like just kind of it being seen to be kind of rude if you develop certain algorithms certain ways, like kind of conventions that sit in society that aren't necessarily formalized. We're going to need all of these different things to come together to kind of control how AI is going to work, I think. And that will be unions, it will be colleges, it will be the way it's taught in universities, it will be the way it's enforced, it will be the law itself. There's never one thing that kind of manages to steer the kind of behaviour that society makes. It's a dense mesh, that's what I've learned about power. It's a dense mesh of different things that have to control it. But, you know, we have to. You know, so really, like, the main challenge for us all is to make all this squishy human stuff as exciting and as fast moving as the actual tech itself. So to make all the institutional development and all the normative development, all of that stuff, actually move to keep up with the tech. Because simply to relish in the tech itself, to relish in its disruption, to relish in its new capabilities, without doing that, that's basically, I think, if you take nothing else away from what I've said today, that's my main fear.
I'm going to build a bit off of what Keegan said more than anything. Startups and scale-ups need to know what to comply with, and they need to know how to do it. It's a much smaller team on knowing how to do that. So for us, I think it is a bit about making sure that the regulators scale up so that it's easier for them to understand what's going on with these companies, as well as there was a small recommendation in the white paper that turned into a 12 to 24 month process on piloting a sandbox. The multi-regulator, multi-sector AI sandbox is probably really critical for making sure that new entrants come to market safely. It's about making sure that all of the regulators are collaborating, coordinating, staffing, investing in what is a sector economy changing technology so that they can keep up. It's about doing that, and it's about making sure that companies, when they're small, not necessarily the big guys, I don't know what the big guys do, but the companies when they're small have the ability to effectively know, okay, this is how I comply, here's an issue that came up, here's like how I can fix that. It's about that coordination as well. I think that both of those coordination of efforts, if nothing else, are the most important bit of what a lot of the speakers were calling balanced creative destruction, safe scaling, whatever that is. The UK, we're not the home of DeepMind anymore. And if we want to be the home of new AI companies, we need to make sure that there is a process that works for them.
One more question here.
I do believe we are actually out of time, and we do need to move on to the
No!
You are more than welcome to speak with the panelists separately, but we do have to continue for the final keynotes for the day, which will be located in the basement. But I'd like to thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to the panelists for this really interesting.